2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, the death and resurrection of Christ just outside the walls. That's kind of the center of history. It is a considerable event that marked the world just after the death of Christ. He was buried in a shroud, the four Gospels speak of it, and this shroud is perhaps the one presented to you here that is called the Shroud of Turin, and the thesis that we are going to defend in this presentation is that today we can conclude that this image imprinted on the shroud cannot be explained otherwise than by the resurrection of the shroud. Christ then in general in our world, which is quite relativistic, quite agnostic, we don't like to conclude. It's better to stay and say we don't know. It's a big mystery. We don't have an explanation. But I don't think it's the most reasonable position, because in some cases you can keep a position by saying it's not. But there are other cases where you know, and you have to be able to distinguish these cases from others. Often in people's minds, when you approach a question like it's either white or it's black. Everything else is gray. Either it's 100% safe and certain, or it's 0% safe and certain and everything. The rest is undetermined or yes. Either it's no and everything else is maybe. And since many questions can't be an absolute yes or an absolute name, we tend to put everything in the category of maybe. And in fact, today, there is a nuance that needs to be brought, because we've been able to think more about probabilities. We know how to estimate things that are infinitely improbable or infinitely probable. And you know that when you start manipulating powers of 10, there's no magnitude in the physical universe that exceeds 10 to the power of 100. So when you reach 10 huge powers because of probabilities, you can say it's almost zero. You can say you're in zero probability. So I think in the case of the shroud, we're going to get closer to these things, the word probabilities. We will also often use the word singularity to show how unique and singular this linen is. So there you have it. So after decades of scientific studies on this object that is now the most studied in the world, there have been 500,000 hours of high-level science to study the shroud, which is unique in the world. In fact, this shroud raises a question. Did God want to leave us a material proof that testifies to the reality of Christ's passion and resurrection, a material object that cannot be explained otherwise than by the reality of Christ's passion and by the reality of Christ's passion, resurrection? So when we ask a question in this way in general, the reactions are irrational. There are people who tell you it's not possible. God can't do that. Our freedom would suffer. Faith isn't that. Faith. We have to believe and throw ourselves into the void. I think that on all this, we have second rectification to make, is that the Catholic faith, we are often mistaken about what it already is. The Vatican Council clearly affirmed that we could access the knowledge of God by natural reason alone afterwards. If you look at the gospel, you see that in the letter of James says that you believe in God very well. The demons also believe in God, and they burn, so the fact of believing in God is not faith. The demons know that there is only one God, but they do not have faith. That's another thing I mean. It's that it's not because we have God's proof that our freedom and our faith are not possible in the Gospel of John. It's very curious. The Pharisees, the scribes, all that. But when he raises Lazarus, and a man who's been dead for 3 days starts to rot and all that, and Jesus raises him up, so that's material evidence. The absolute proof that is given is real proof, and on that day the Jews decide to kill him. So that means that in relation to any evidence, even if it is evidence, it is true and valid. One keeps one's freedom, and must take an act of faith. For example, when Jesus appears to his disciples after the resurrection, Thomas is not there. He comes 8 days later, and he says, I want to put my hand in his side. I want to touch him, and all that, so he does it. Christ grants him, and in the end, Jesus tells him, stop being unbelieving. Be a believer. So in the face of such evidence, well, there's more to it. It's the total proof when you touch the risen Christ after he has died. You could say to yourself, there's faith, there's no more. No, that's not what Christ is asking Thomas to be a believer anyway. This means that faith is not knowledge. Faith is an adhesion of our freedom. We can refuse it, even in the face of proofs that are true proofs, like Thomas or Lazarus. The shroud is part of his proof, which are before us and which we can refuse, but which are still of an evidentiary nature. If you are Sherlock Holmes, or if you are Columbo, between two theses, you will try to carry out an investigation by looking at what works and what does not. So, this investigation before 1988, all the conclusions of all the scientific studies carried out in all fields converge in favor of the authenticity of the shroud. And then in 1988, there is the carbon-14 test, which concluded differently by saying that it was a cloth from the Middle Ages of dating. We can dispute it with a lot of mania, but in any case, it led to this conclusion. So today, in fact, you have two theses. There's a first thesis, which is that it is indeed the shroud of Christ. That is to say, that according to this thesis, we see the true passion of Christ on it. There is the flash of the resurrection to imprint the image. Christians have kept this relic in a very, very precious way since the beginning. And the mystery of the shroud is being revealed today, which is not at all illogical, because we are in a moment when the faith is being completely attacked in a rather special way. So there's a special help that is given to God's people. It's not surprising. The shroud really started a new life with photography that was done at the end of the 19th century. So this thesis is quite logical in itself. There's a second thesis, which is that it is the work of a forger, or that it was done by itself around the Middle Ages, who therefore had an imitation of the elements of passion that the image was produced by. A process that we still ignore today. This cloth has been passed off as a relic from the year 14,153 or a little earlier, and science will one day be able to explain all this. This thesis also has a certain logic, but we will have to decide between the two, so to carry out the investigation, we will go through the history of the shroud first, then the scientific studies, the conclusion, and then the astonishing correspondence of this linen, with all the details of the passion, and we're going to do it to go through looting, because we would have to talk for 107 years about this linen of all. The studies that have been done, there are whole books. We're going to try to be able to conclude, to focus on 5 particular points, 5 key points, that we're going to look at especially, and we'll ask ourselves on each point. Is this point not decisive? The first point in looking at the history of the shroud is the Loner Codex. So the thesis is that history proves that this shroud obviously existed long before the year 944. Why do we talk about it in 944? Because we will see in history that this is the moment when the shroud arrived in Constantinople, and from there, it is the moment when the shroud arrived. Evoked very precisely in a book called the Codex of Clos, which is the first text in Hungarian that is kept in the library of Budapest, and this document has the advantage of being historically indisputable. That is to say, that it can be dated very precisely between 1192 and 1195, and this text, we will see for what reason we cannot deny that the image reproduced in this codex speaks of the Shroud of Turin. So, if we go back to the thread of the story, Jesus is dead. In the year 30, he was put in a shroud, and you know that the Virgin Mary is the image of the church. She has the heart that vibrates in the same way that the heart of the church is, so as the church is attached to the relics and to the holy place the Virgin was too. So the first disciples will obviously collect the precious relics of Christ. We can list, for example, the crown of thorns, the spear, the chalice, the nails, the sponge, the shroud of Oviedo, possibly the tunic of Argenteuil. You may have heard of all this, and one day we will also find with St. Helena the cross of Christ. All this, these are the relics of Christ. The first Christians obviously collected them, but during a whole first period, between the year 30 and 30, birth of 544, we will say it was a period of persecution. That is to say, the Christians were hunted down in all corners of the world, and there were martyrs. It's very hard to be a Christian, and so obviously the relics are hidden. So it's quite logical. We don't have any historical traces of the shroud that was probably hidden. And it's true that when you look at the shroud, if you look there, you see on the sides there are traces of watermarks, and there are people who have people. Notice that if you fold the shroud on itself, you put it in a vase, and you imagine that there is a little bit of water that goes to the bottom. And well, we can get to tasks like that. So it's a thesis that is quite valid only at a certain point. The shroud has been folded and is hidden in a damp place. Then the key year, the amazing year, is 544. What happens in 544 all of a sudden? There is this news that is historical that helps north of Mesopotamia a miraculous image. Not man-made to repel enemies, Persians. So what is this kingdom of death? In fact, it is the first kingdom that became Christian at the end of the 2nd century. Christians were persecuted in every corner of the world. There is a kingdom that becomes Christian, and as if by chance, which is quite logical, the most important relics of Christendom will find refuge in this place. And at the moment when Hades is attacked, a cloth is taken out, and the enemies are routed, this story is reported everywhere. So we're pretty sure that there was an amazing event around a cloth like that in Hades in 544. All the testimonies say to Hades are talking about the face of Christ. So we were able to, with the work of Aldo Guerreschi, notice that there were fold marks on the shroud. It was folded in 8. We can imagine that it was kept like this and that we saw only the part of the face, and so we said that it is the face of Christ. So what happens in 544? This is a pivotal date for the depiction of Christ, because previously, before 544, Christ was always depicted as a beardless young man, a shepherd with curly hair. You see that in the catacombs. We see this in Rome, in Ravenna, in Milan, and this is the representations that we had classically before 544. And all of a sudden, after 544, the face of Christ changes. He takes on a more elongated aspect, a Hebrew beard. The elongated Hebrew nose, we find it in the magnificent image of the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. We also find it on coins. Every time the shroud appears in history in one way or another, there are abnormal coins, because normally coins do not have the face of Christ, very rare. But we realize that every time the shroud takes him out in history, there are coins that are attached to this face that sit in every corner of the world at the Basilica of Constantinople. Christ is represented on a model that is the same as the one you have in the church where Mass was said just now, the model that everyone knows. So, after this pivotal date in 650, the Muslims managed to conquer Hades and the linen is hidden, but we know that it remains venerated. There are testimonies about it, and in fact it was a certain providence that the linen was hidden again in a Muslim context, because between 730 and 797, there will be what is called the iconoclastic quarrel. that is, in the Byzantine Empire. We're going to start destroying all the images because we don't think it respects the commandments of the Old Testament, but there's a whole quarrel about it. In the end, it is decided by a council that says no, now that Christ became man. He took on a face, and therefore Christ can be represented. But if ever the shroud had been kept in a Christian context, it would have been destroyed. There was been destroyed. There was a phenomenal amount of images that were destroyed at that time by those who had power and who was iconoclastic. So luckily, it was hidden in the Muslim context, and it was preserved. After that, the Byzantine Empire, after destroying the icons, it becomes icon and a half, i.e., all of a sudden, all the icons become extremely sought after. And we hear about this DS icon who is extraordinary. And so there's a special expedition that is led by the Byzantine Empire in 943 to break into the Muslim Empire and go to siege to the city of Ed. Is especially, that's historic. We know this for sure. And finally, he stops in front of the life of a goddess, and instead of waging war and attacking the city, they will negotiate for the precious relic to be given to them in exchange for 12,000 gold coins, and all the prisoners they had, i.e. 200 prisoners, were given in exchange for the relic. This relic is then brought to Constantinople. The Emperor of Byzantium receives it in a triumphal procession. We have dozens of testimonies about it. It happens on August 15, 94. There is a drawing that is published 2 centuries later by Jansky, which illustrates this. We see the emperor stirring the face of Christ on a cloth that has a certain length, but is it the Shroud of Turin? We don't care. Doubt, but we're going to take it for sure, thanks to the Codex, closely. So for the time being, the shroud is kept in the Church of the Black Air, but in the Pharaoh, i.e. the Church of the Basins, it is north of Constantinople, is the Pharos, which is where the emperor was, that we have testimonies circulating from one to the other. Here is Gregory, the referendary, who went to Hades to fetch the shroud, who verified that it was indeed this relic when he was given the 200 prisoners and the gold coins. He evokes this imprint and says that it is embellished by the drops of blood gushing from the side of Christ. So we can see that it's not just a face, there's also the side. There are still other testimonies, but finally, as I told you around 1190, the shroud is precisely evoked in the Codex de Pre, which is the first indisputable text in Hungarian. So what makes us think for sure that it was by seeing the shroud that we drew this image? Well, it's simply the position of Christ, the position of the hands, and especially the fact that we only see 4 fingers of Christ. We don't see the thumb, and that's unique in the history of the shroud. There is no image in the past that has thought to express a detail like that. And where it comes from, well, Surgeon Barbet, who made experiment in 1932. He wrote the Passion according to the surgeon while looking at the shroud. He found that when nails are driven into the space of the desto, not in the palms of the hands, as all the representations of all the representation, Christ did. But if you do that on a body that you're crucified, in fact, the weight of the body will tear the hand and the body will fall. So the Romans, who were a bit of experts in crucifixion since they had done thousands of them, he crucified in the space of the salter. Desto, that is to say at the level of the wrist, and there the body holds perfectly simply when you put a nail in that place. You tap on a tune, and the thumb retracts, and with a body that is paralyzed with cadaveric rigidity, the thumb will remain in that position. And when Christ on the shroud, but the hands on the lower abdomen, we only see 4 fingers. That is a detail that no one could think of. It's a detail that you see in this picture, and that you don't see in any other image before the shroud. So it's a textbook case of something absolutely indisputable. And you see, if you look at other details of the Loan Codex, you see that in one place on the cloth, there are 4 dots that form a E. It is actually on the shroud. If you look, you see on the part left there 4 dots that form an L at the top and bottom following a fire. There were holes that were made in the shroud, so this detail that is reproduced on the image of the Loan collection cannot be invented either. We are on absolutely indisputable things. There you have it. There are several other details. We're not going to go into too much detail, so the story continues in 1203. There is a French knight called Robert de Clary, who arrives and says that he saw the silo at Anne, that is to say, the shroud of Christ where our circus was wrapped, which every Friday stood straight up so that we could see the figure of our Lord. Constantinople, every Friday, the shroud was exposed in its entire length, standing straight up so that people could come and venerate it. And then comes the famous date of April 14, 1204. You know that the Fourth Crusade, with 33,000 French Crusaders, 17,000 Venetians, attacked Constantinople. Hippie the city for 3 days. It's 3 days of horror, a real scandal against Christians. And she this occasion, Robert de Clary, so the knight specifies in 1204 that never again, no one there nor French. What is the shroud of wine can? The city was taken. Simply, we know that it is a French knight as much of the rock who enters the church of La Carnée at the place where the shroud was certainly. And then a year then, in 205, the Byzantine Prince Common protested to Pope Innocent III and wrote him a letter between the exactions of the Crusaders demanding the restitution of only one of them. This is what he wrote last year in the month of April. To distract from a supposed liberation of the Holy Land, the Crusader army has just devastated Constantinople. During this devastation, the soldiers of Venice and France gave themselves up to the plundering of the sacred buildings. They took the 13 hours of gold, silver and ivory, and let themselves share with the Venetians the relics of the saints to the French. What was most sacred among the latter, the shroud in which was wrapped after his death, and before his resurrection, our Lord. Jesus Christ is an official letter from Prince Common. And he specifies a little further the theft of so many sacred things goes against the law of men and the laws of God. We know that these sacred things are kept in Venice and France and other countries of the plunderers, the sacred shroud being in Athens. And then we realize that in the same year, in 1205, it is the knight from Franche-Comté, at the time of the Rock, who becomes Duke of Athens, with the Champagne people, the Burgundians, and the Franc-Comtois, the French, who reign for a little more than a century in Athens, and who will be chased out by the Catalans. And so, after this episode where we know that the shroud passed through Athens, we find in France in 1357 the first exhibition in France of the shroud in Lirey in Champagne. And at the end of this exhibition, the linen was recovered from 453 by the House of Savoy, which kept it until 1983 and which knew it to be in the Vatican. So we know very, very well the history that happened in France, but we also know very, very well all the history before, and we come back to this point, the Codex, closely. Witness unquestionably, hi, it is indeed shroud, and we can trace them and so up to Edys. It means that it's not a cloth from the Middle Ages. That means this number 2 is already cancelled. It's not true that the shroud comes from the Middle Ages. The second point that we're going to focus on is that the shroud and the negative is that it's been around for centuries. And we also know that this notion of negative and totally unknown before the 19th century, there is no image of any kind. It is no image. Represents a negative before the 19th century. Then for the little story Saint Therese of the child Jesus and the saint daughter. She went to heaven in 1897. She had promised to go on to do good on earth. She obviously had a special devotion to the holy face of Christ. Putting in her name is just 1 year. Then came the great ostension of the shroud in 1890. So it's a year in which the church decides to make a solemn high tension in a rather strong anti-clerical context. At the end of the 19th century, in all the revenants, not all the dissenters of the faith, and the miracle was considered something impossible. Christian beliefs were ridiculed, and it was considered from another age at that time. There is an amateur called Segundo Pia, who was allowed to take the first photo of the shroud, so at the time when we took pictures, it was a little more complicated. Then today you had to make a photographic plate, put it in a developer in a darkroom, and when he does that, he pulls out the photo of the shroud in his darkroom, and realizes that it's a negative. So that's in the moment. It was a complete surprise. That is to say, what is usually represented in dark was in light, and what is represented in light and dark and with shades. You see, a photographic negative. You don't know that it's because you take pictures now with digital cameras, but at the time when photography was invented in 1826 by Nicéphore Niepce, he took the first photo you see here. It's the photo of his house. It was therefore a process by which silver salt was applied to a pane of glass. There was a lens in the outer image printed in a few seconds on the glass plate, and changed the silver salt to the colors of the silver salt. And we fixed this image, and then we had it in negative. That is to say, that what was bright had become dark, and what was dark had become bright. And we spent 30 years wondering how we were going to change it, and make it a positive. And it was finally in the 1860s that we managed to make a second transfer that made it possible to arrive at a positive. So you see, it's not easy. It's a complicated notion, and no one had imagined it. No one had designed it until the 19th century. But the shroud has been preserved for a long time, and it had the character of a negative image. So when Segundo comes out with this image, he shows this face, which is still very striking, and it has the effect of a bomb. That is to say, for the first time, we see a face, but we say to ourselves, but what is this? Thing is this is the face of Christ. And we start with the accused of lies. We say, he is a liar. He tampered with the image. It's not the real one. So as the shroud was again stamped, since there is an extremely strong protection of it, it is only in the 1930s that the second photo of the shroud will be made, and that it will allow to show with bailiffs, the experts, during a high tension of will show, that Peter had not lied. But at the moment, everyone falls on him, and they say, but it's not possible. It's not true. And there are at that moment French people, the Professor Yves of the age, who has an active anti-stick regaling you, his assistant Paul Vignon, who wants masks, and the deception who starts to analyze photos of Segundo Pia. And finally, after analysis, they are completely turned around, and they are going to make a synthesis that is going to be presented to the Academy of Sciences in 1902. And they are going to conclude by saying, there is no doubt this bears the extremely realistic imprint of a man who is crucified according to the manner of Roman antiquity. They do everything in development, he concludes, by saying to our knowledge, there is no other Roman condemned to crucifixion, who is at the same time scourged, crowned with thorns, and speared, all of which are found inscribed in the image of the shroud. The Academy of Sciences did not accept the president, who was Marcellin Berthelot, who was a notorious anti-clerical, refused to record the deposition, and what he said in front of everyone for the first time, they refused to record for ideological reasons, and from there, I replied to Berthelot afterwards, in a letter which I often say whether instead of Christ, it had been a question of a star of some pharaoh. No one can find anything to complain about. You are aware, and in all areas, there are philosophical presuppositions and a priorist that count for a lot. Met Einstein when he was offered the Big Bang Theory. Oh no, that's not possible. We're going to do it differently. We're going to put a constant to prevent it from being too close to the creation of the Big, so it has a priori. It counts a lot, and it's not that it's the Shroud of Christ. So after that, there will be a lot of studies. The most important will be the study in 1978 of the sock. So the string research project of the 32 American scientists in 24 will come. With 6 tons of material, and who do 300,000 hours of studies on only one with all the technical means possible his studies. In Valais, look a little close, but let's stay on this first point. Simply the fact that it is a negative image. It's just as impossible that someone designed them before the 19th century. This idea of TIFF damage, there were no examples in the past in the Middle Ages. The notion was inconceivable at the time. Second time, it was useless because it gives a rather mediocre result, unsightly, blurry, and why create a negative when the image could have been made directly positive, like especially the fake shroud, the new household. And then third time, there are a lot of details that are a lot of detail, barely noticeable to the naked eye. If you get closer to the shroud, you see almost nothing of the things that can be apprehended with very powerful photographic processes of modern, and these things exist on the My Sister. There was no reason to write it when we didn't see them if there was ever a forger. It would ever a forger have been necessary who works not for his contemporaries, but for the 20th. Overall, it is impossible. We can stop on this second point on its own. It shows that the shroud could not have been anything other than so much. Here is the first point on the material of the shroud. Third point, this linen is a kind of exposition of the Gospel of the Passion, by listing 18 details unknown in the middle. Pages that make the image inconceivable, even at that time. All the studies that followed for a century were to conclude. So as we had said in a concordant way, and it is the most studied object in the world, then first of all, if we look at the fabric itself, it is a cloth of 4M40 by 1M10, which is made up of a lymphophore is woven in a herringbone pattern, that is to say, a weaving process that was known in the Middle East at the time of Jesus and the line, for with a little cotton without any trace of wool. It corresponds to the rules of Jewish looms. Why? Because there were 2 texts of the Bible, in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, which said that one should not wear a garment mixed with different fibers, so it was necessary to separate wool and linen. Jewish looms had this particularity, whereas in all other cases, there were always little bits and pieces lying around. We found a little bit of the Jews. Things were totally the same, so you can't find wool. That's an interesting second point. Third point, for authenticity, the complete nudity of the body until the Middle Ages. Even when we talk about the shroud, we bore them in that the body is completely naked. It was not at all in the morals. There are engravings of the shroud represents the shroud with clothes to avoid the nun. So that's also an interesting point. The fourth very striking point is that the man on the shroud has been violently scourged. There are 120 marks of blows with what is called the flagrum. Romaine are small dumbbells with a double ball that are characteristic of fools in Romaine. And if you look closely in the detail of Christ's back on the shroud each time, you have small pairs like it corresponds to these small dumbbells with which we whipped. This was also very, very hard indented for people who lived in the Middle Ages. And we can see that he was whipped by a trapper on the left and a trapper on the right. In double fan, as they say, he was hanged like this as seen in this picture, and both hit on either side. The costs were distributed as if there were really any hitters. Fifth point on the head. We see multiple traces of bleeding caused by thorns that have pierced the scalp. So, I insist on saying, if we retrace the thread of history, it is obvious at the time when the soldiers improvised the crown of thorns of Christ. They took the first bush next to it. They're a little bit stung in their hands, but there's a kind of wreath, and they circled it with something. To the crown of Christ that St. Louis bought at such a high price to keep in Paris in the Sainte-Chapelle. In fact, it was mostly the part that surrounded the thorns. This is the logic that we deduced from the Gospels. We find it on the Shroud of Turin, with a crown of thorns that pierced the scalp of Christ in a cap and not in a circular way. Then there's the spear shot. This man received after his death, we can prove it, a spear blow on the side that pierced the pericardium. There was a flow of blood that can be seen on the shroud. There was also serum because we did spectrography. That is to say, we sent a light on the shroud, and we noticed with the light that was reflected that had traces of human serum on this part of Christ. So when the gospel says that blood and water will come out, we're right in it. It's also a detail that would be really difficult to invent in the Middle Ages. On the face, we see violent blows. We see the nasal cartilage that has been deflected, swelling on the nose and on the cheek. Someone who has been beaten. This is a seventh point. We talked about these nails in the wrists, which are really something quite extraordinary. All the representations of Christ before the shroud. Put the nails in the palms of your hands, and the accuracy of scientists, it's on the shroud. There were also several studies on pollen, so they're disputed, because there have been no serious scientific publications. Articles Ginger said that the reason was that when people did pollen research, they applied school to be able to extract pollen from laundry, and school distorts pollen. It's hard to publish. But all the studies have said that there are endemic pollens, i.e. pollens that are only found in the Jerusalem area at the time of the Passover of the Jewish spring. So even if these studies are disputed, it is also an important element that has been tested by several teams. Another point that is not disputed in him is that aragon dust, the limestone of Jerusalem, has been found. Aragon exists in other parts of the world, but it is found in the nose, feet, and knee of the man who is on the shroud. So in the hypothesis of Christ, it fits perfectly. He fell into his passion. He tapped on the ground, and that we find small fragments of the dust of Aragon. It is completely justified, and if ever someone had to create a shroud in the Middle Ages in France, never. He would think of putting small crystals of Aragon of the stone of Jerusalem to deceive his world. Well, it's just impossible. 11th point. There has been an actual contact of a human body with blood, sweat, serum, but no trace of putrefaction, which usually comes before 30 o'clock. Not always. There are miraculous preserved bodies in the Catholic Church, but usually between 30 around to church and 40 o'clock, you already have traces of hoar refraction. There is none on the shroud. So the body didn't stay in contact with the shroud for long. Then if you look closely at the blood marks, you see that first of all, the image that was produced on the shroud that represents the body, it does not print underneath the bloodstains, so the bloodstains existed before the production of the image, but especially when you glue a human body. Blood coagulates very, very quickly, and then when you tear the body off, you tear off a small part of the microscopic parts of the fibers. This is mandatory and fine in this particular case. It's as if the body has disintegrated. There's no trace of defibrillar tearing. That's something that has convinced a lot of people that we're talking about the body of Christ. Transform even better. So it's very important to point out that there was no tearing of the girls for their tearing off of the body, and then the blood is found on the shroud. It is a very rare group, but an outgroup, and the same one found on the back and on the argenteau tunic, so all this fits perfectly. Last but not least, there is a testimony. It is necessary to see from Marie Schwartz, who is a fair photographer and participated in the work of the On for 60. It was a Jew who followed the study of the shroud with the whole team, who was passionate about it, all but he had one point. It bothered a little. It was that the blood on the shroud was red. And he says, but not possible blood after a few years. Even more, it turns black. And finally, one day. He was taught that when a body is subjected to intense stress for several hours, he liked bilirubin. Bilirubin, that is generated by the body, will fix the blood in the red. And when he learned this, so if we talk about Christ, he suffered all the agony, sterep, and all the passion. His body was traumatized. And this secretion of bilirubin justifies that the blood had to remain red. So there too, there is something quite striking.
The man I'd worked with on the bone with the moss called me back and said, Mary, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin, Jerry? And I said, but I'm Jewish, and he told me too. He was Jewish, also an expert. He explained to me that at that time, several scientists had taken a picture of the shroud, and he told me that they were so astonished that this image was of such characteristics that they were going to gather a team of scientists to see if he could get permission to go to Turin and examine the shroud to try to understand how this image was formed. About 2 months into the project, I remember saying Alan to my colleagues, What is a young Jewish man like me doing here? And he comes in and he said to me, have you forgotten that the man in the shroud is a Jew? No, I know. And he gave me what might be the best advice I've ever had in my life. He walked away and do the best job you can. God doesn't explain his project to us in advance, but one day you'll know. It was great advice, and it made me stay in the team. I was going to resign, but because of his words, God maybe through his lips, I stayed on the team. The thing that has kept me from accepting that the shroud is authentic for 18 years is that the blood on the shroud is still red. The old blood must be black or brown. No one could explain for 18 years why the blood on the shroud remained red. In 1995, in a telephone conversation with Dr. Adler, a Jewish chemist who proved that the blood on the shroud is really blood. We were talking on the phone, and then he said something to me that I had never heard of. When someone is tortured over a long period of time, 24, 36 hours, about the length of time Jesus was tortured, the body goes into a state of shock. Jesus didn't get water. He was flogged, so he went into anaphylactic shock. After some time in this kind of shock, the walls of the red blood cells begin to break down, and the liver spreads an enzyme called bilirubin in the body. And when this happens, the blood stays red forever. And when I found out about that, it was the last piece of the puzzle, and it gave me the conviction that the shroud is genuine, because it gave me a scientific and credible answer to the last question I had.
All the details of the Passion are found in the full of Christ alone. And then we arrive at a fourth point, which is absolutely striking. Try to figure out how this image was printed. By what radiation the image has been imprinted on the shroud, then we can be sure that the image is not imprinted by contact. Because if you put paint on a face, and you print a cloth, and then you take off the cloth, you will see that the face is distorted, then the face of Christ. It is a village that is not deformed. It's not by paint either. It's a certainty for many reasons. There is a total absence of pigment. There is no collagen. And then we can also say that the image that has imprinted on the linen is there and studied by specialists. And the linen is very starchy, very hungry. It's 0.3 millinit. And the burn at the bottom is not really a burn if you call it a dehydrating acid oxidation. This dehydrating acid oxidation, it only concerns the first microns of the surface of the laundry. There is nothing underneath. If you look at the other side, you see absolutely nothing. So any paint, any dye, any object with the cloth, pierce it by 0.3 mm. You are on the weed. Absolutely do not have that. And when we analyze closely what this kind of flax burn is, it is very superficial and it has distance information. The image to be rubbed off degradation of the stamps gives a three-dimensional information by looking if it is more or less in the burns of the fibers. We will be able to reconstruct a 3D image of the shroud. There's Thierry Castet, who made a 3D image that you see on the left, and then Sons, who made a hologram that rotates and gives a living look to the face. We can do that simply because there are parts that are more burned than others, and so if we interpret this burn by giving it a distance value, the face of Christ is reconstructed. This doesn't exist anywhere in any image from any era, and we are unable to even redo it today. No one would be able to do that kind of burns and that kind of information on an image again today. So the conclusion of all this is that the image was produced by a radiation that is extremely special if we want to try to understand what kind of radiation it could have been. Look at this image of Christ at all. Christ is horizontal. One can imagine that it is weightless and that you have the shroud that is perfectly straight above and below. And at some point, there's a ray that is going to be vertical, i.e. orthogonal, to the shroud that is going to print the image, because be careful. If you make a radiation a classic light, you don't print anything at all, because a classic light goes in all directions, so there is no sharp image. The radiation has to be unidirectional. It's a crazy thing. If you want the body to be imprinted on the shroud in this way, It must start from the body. This radiation is all the more powerful the shorter the distance. You see the radiation that creates the three-dimensional effect, but also that this radiation is perfectly orthogonal to the shroud, which must be flat. If the shroud was floating a little bit haphazardly with the image going in all directions, you'd have nothing at all. You'd have much trying to imagine it. We're talking about unidirectional radiation orthogonal to the shroud printed on a flying carpet. If you think in minutes, there is no other way to conceive of the production of this image.
Uncertain terms.
Yes, it could be tensed by something else, okay, but it has to be flat, and then the craziest thing.
He said if you put candle ready in the income very strong light, you're going to have a burn gradient, but not a burn like that, so you're the one who's crazy. It's not so much gravity and, oh no, that's crazy. This is directional radiation, because there is no other explanation for making a sharp image. So in the midst of all these concordant elements that come from different fields of study, carbon-14 dating has a different date by saying it can be between 12,138 and 14,130. This is the conclusion of science in quotation marks. I like the exclamation mark after science, which is supposed to be neutral. She dates the laundry to the Middle Ages, she replied. But if you think about seconds, there must have been radiation on the shroud, Father Renato, to give the most sensible explanation. He said this radiation when we tried to do other experiments to try to get close to this effect on the shroud noted. When they bombarded the shroud by the bursting of deuterium particles with protons and neutrons, it gave this type of dehydrating acid oxidation, very close to that of the shroud. And so there you have it. We have a little model of the kind of effect that we can achieve. But when you do a bombardment with a radiation like that, you will change the rate of carbon-14, because precisely the proton and neutrons will change the rate of carbon-14 and rejuvenate the tissue. So in fact, there is an explanation that is quite consistent, and that is that there was radiation of an unknown type in the year 30, and that radiation disturbed the carbon-14 level on the shroud. Fifth and last point, the absolute singularity makes it this object, as we have seen. It is unique and non-reproducible in 1,000 ways. How to explain? There is no other object of this type that we come close to in any way. There is no image that takes up the same 2 or 3 aspects. This image, unique in the world. Then the world. Reasoning is very simple. If this image, you may come from natural causes, common. There would be other similar cases. The fact that the image was brought about by the resurrection of Christ is the only coherenter, because if you have an absolutely singular event like the resurrection of Christ, it's normal that it produces an absolutely singular effect like this image. You have a singularity that responds to another singularity. If, on the other hand, you exclude, on the other hand, you exclude the resurrection of Christ and you want it to be a natural cause, a human cause. There's no reason. I didn't have another reason. There is a projection between the singularity of the linen and the singularity of the events of the resurrection. So if we tried to be honest in the reasoning, each of its key points when we have spoken allows us to conclude. We can try to summarize all this in a logical tree. If you consider the shroud of you, it was made by someone or no one did it. It was made by someone. We know that it must have been in the Middle Ages or before the Middle Ages. But this is impossible because 18 years ago, the state was absolutely inconceivable. Unknown in the Middle Ages, the image could not be conceived in that way. Not the negative, the weaving, the nails, the shape of the blood, the pollen, the limestone. All that. So this object is really inconceivable in the Middle Ages. This hypothesis is impossible. So it was made on its own. So either it was done by radiation or it was done by contact with the body. We saw that contact with the body was impossible because there was no distortion of the image, so it's radiation. We are sure of it, but it's a radiation, as we said, very special. It's orthogonal and not diffuse. It proceeds from an acid desiccant oxidation. There is an effect that is only superficial, and there was still a distance information, and all this presupposes a weightless body with the shroud around all that. It's strictly impossible to reproduce to this day. The science of today, of the 21st century, would not be able to remake an image like that. So we can say to ourselves, could this radiation have been produced by a natural cause? Or is it produced by a supernatural cause? The natural cause. Frankly, it is very improbable because the mechanism is inexplicable. There is no other example. There is this absolute singularity. If a natural cause produced this type of image, the same cause is producing the same effects in other situations, we would have produced images that were at least a little similar, a little comparable. We have nothing. So in this solution is also to be excluded. So in fact, we arrive at the only possible solution to supernatural cause, which is the only coherent explanation. So we're talking about an image produced by the flash of the resurrection. The body of Christ, with the whole gospel of the passion. Perfectly logical. A singular cause, which explains a singular effect. There you have it. something extremely logical. So in conclusion by itself, this shroud should change the world means that you present the physical proof. And basically you can say that atheism is false and Islam. In particular, because Islam says that Christ was not crucified. It's quite surprising. Islam says that Christians are going to go to hell because they believe that Jesus is risen. In short, they associate with God, but should not be associated. But in the vision of Islam, it is God who has substituted a doppelganger for Christ. So God has deceived the Christians, in fact, in a way. And he will then reproach them for believing that it was really Jesus when he is the one who chose him. So, in Islam, they say Jesus wasn't crucified. So if that's Jesus crucified, it doesn't work. So the Christian faith is true. And when we reread the Passion, we are also touched because Christ loved us beyond all imaginable. So if we were to stick to rational reasoning, we would have to conclude that we have to convert that Christ is really, yes. But the question is that, in fact, I'm something that I discovered in time, because when I was young like you, I thought that people were reasonable. I thought that we were all reasonable, and that this is the reason first, and that in fact behind it, we were following our reason. We were reasonable beings. And well, in fact, the more it goes, the more I think that we are not reasonable beings at all. Its most reasoning is based on feelings, interests, and in fact, to admit that God exists, to admit that Christ really had to incarnate, dead, resurrected. It bothers a lot of people because they have the impression that they are going to lose their autonomy, their freedom. It calls into question their life and so. They prefer to deny all that. That's a little bit. But let us Christians be reassured. We can think that reason is with us, and that the shroud is the true shroud of Christ. That's what I think. Thank you then. So what I'm proposing to you now is that there are a couple of questions. What is called evidence in common parlance? What are Columbo and Sherlock Holmes looking for when they make an investigation? There are two theories. There is he is guilty. He's not guilty. He was with the candlestick. He has DNA traces on the thing and everything. So for me, it's evidence that he was a piece of evidence. That's what invalidates a thesis and what makes the other valid when you do a police investigation. You look for evidence, and in the end, the mother has to make a diagnosis and come to a conclusion. You do it from material elements. That is a moment. You say there's speed, it's invalid, because that element makes it invalid. I say that the thesis of the Middle Ages is invalid by the codex of the codex, which is absolutely clear. It is invalid by the 18 details on the shroud. It is invalid by the idea of the native. And it is invalid by the idea of the singularity of this lens. That's each of those elements on its own. It's enough to clear the ground so good. And what I'm just saying is that the test is never binding. You can resurrect Lazarus, the Jews say. Well, if Jesus did that, we're going to kill him. So his proof doesn't prevent freedom. A proof leaves you completely free, and then you do what you want with it, but that's still a proof.
Excuse me.
But in your opinion, that's what I'm saying with the example of Thomas. He puts his hand in Christ's side. He says, if I don't put my hand in his side, if I don't put my finger in his side, my hand in his holes, I wouldn't believe. Okay, Jesus shows up, and Jesus tells him, no more now. You don't need to take any more since you've seen. No, he told her, stop being an unbeliever. That's a mind-blowing phrase. This means that he gives him complete proof that he was resurrected 8 days after seeing him completely dead. And he tells him not to need faith anymore. He says, no, I ask you for faith, because faith is not a matter of knowledge. Faith is about an adhesion. You have to want it. And once again, as the demons say, they know that there is only one God, but they don't have faith because they burn one day or another. We will all be in front of God. We will all be that God exists. But on the other hand, there will be those who speak their will to God, and those who say, we don't want it. We remain free. Faith is not a matter of knowledge. Jesus, he didn't tell people to take a pencil. God, 3 people. You have to plan everything. It's good. I have faith. No, but he wanted us to look for him. He's looking for a support, in fact. He's looking for someone to love him. So faith is not at that level the same as knowledge. We can do the analysis of 1,000 points. There were, as I tell you, there were 500,000 hours of work on this, and everything all agrees. What I just want to say is, in the end, the big question. That's what we conclude. What do we do with this gift? Because in fact, it's a gift from God. What do we do with it? Do we conclude by saying, oh well, it's very, very mysterious. We don't know him well. We'll see one day, and maybe we don't say anything. Is that the right attitude? Or is it that in the face of this accumulation of evidence or signs that we've been given, do we say, well, no, the probability that it's not the only one is equal to 0.1. And so we have an element that gives us material proof of Christ's resurrection and death on the cross as the Gospels speak of it. I think it's very important. That's what I need to practice on. Discernment. That is to say, do we conclude, or do we do all this study? We have an incoherent attitude by saying as usual, we are agnostic as usual. It's all relative. No, there are things at some point. We are past the stage of being able to conclude.
That's it. Thank you.